Anyway, if my mother was here today instead of me, you'd see this tiny woman who's about this tall with an accent like Zsa Zsa Gabor's. She would sound like this. Good morning, my darlings childrens. I am so happy to see all your beautiful faces, and I want you to know that I've come here today because I love you. And she'd mean that with her whole heart. Mom was born in Poland, and she was the oldest of 5 beautiful sisters, she used to say. But her dream was to become a nurse, and so when she graduated high school, her parents sent her off to nursing school. She'd never been away from home by herself before, and so it was nerve-wracking and exciting at the same time. Unfortunately, Mom had only been to school maybe 2 weeks when one morning, it was September 1st, 1939, she left the school building to do some early studying. But when she walked outside, she said the sun that had been out was covered by airplanes that were flying all over, dropping bombs everywhere. Within minutes, the landscape around her changed because of the bombs. The whole area was in chaos, and they had to quickly turn her school into a makeshift hospital where they took care of the people that were wounded and injured. But 16 days later, Stalin from the Soviet Union also invaded Poland from the other end, and just like that, her whole country was gone. She continued to do what little she could. She just barely had any education in nursing at all. But one afternoon, she said there was a group of people who came by. They called themselves the Polish Underground, or the Partisans. And they were looking for volunteers, people who would join up, go into the forest, and do what they could to fight the enemies that had taken over their country. Well, some of the teachers, students joined up, and Mom, who was still 17 years old, she joined up too. They literally did have to go out into the woods. They dug holes in the forest floor to live and covered themselves with tarps and blankets. It was a hellish time, and it didn't take very long to find out that the Polish army was completely defeated before it even got started. Mom said she would wake up every morning to those who had taken their lives in the middle of the night just out of desperation, and because of her nursing background, it was up to her to clean the bodies before they were buried. Time went on, and eventually the little bit of food they had was completely gone, and so a small group decided they had to go to a nearby town to get some more supplies, and Mom was part of this group. They walked through the forest floor until they got to the road that led to the town. And when they got there, the older people in the group said, Irene, that was my mother's name, Irena Gut or Irene, you stay back and mark the trail. We'll go get what we need and come back. So she stood there all by herself, and she said at the edge of town she could smell a bakery, hot, fresh cinnamon rolls. You know how good that smells anyway, but when you're starving, the smell was intoxicating, and she was so concentrating on that she didn't hear or see a truck full of Soviet soldiers coming her way. But those soldiers saw her. They jumped out of the truck and chased her, and she ran as fast as she could, but they caught her. They beat her, ripped her clothes off, gang raped her, and left her for dead. I don't know how long she laid there, but eventually another truck full of Soviet soldiers came by, and they spotted her body lying there, stopped, picked her up, threw her in the back of the truck, dropped her off at a Soviet hospital. I don't know how long she stayed there either, but eventually she got better. She was told she'd never be able to have children because of her injuries. She wasn't free to leave. She became a forced laborer there. And it too was a dangerous place for her, but at one point she found a way to escape. She jumped out of a 2-story window, fit through a little crack in the fence, and ran as fast as she could. She didn't know where she was, but she hoped maybe a town or two away she had an aunt that lived in that direction, and this time very carefully she made her way through the streets. But one evening she came to a part of the town she said was just weird. Streets empty, doors to buildings and houses left wide open, windows broken, not a soul in sight. She was tired, and she found a building, went upstairs, and fell asleep on a 2nd-story floor. But in the morning, she woke up to screaming and shouting down in the street. She went to the window, and she looked down, and she saw a sight no one was meant to see. Our history books refer to it as a death march, but what Mom saw was a mass of people being herded down the street like they were cattle. They were all Jews. She could tell they had bands on their arm with the Star of David that every Jew had to wear in Poland. And they were being forced down the street by German soldiers waving guns and shouting at them. Mom noticed one young mother was holding a tiny child as she walked, and a German soldier was screaming at her. The woman didn't understand German, but Mom did. He was saying she wasn't moving fast enough. And then with one movement of his hand, he grabbed the child from her, threw it in the air, and shot it like it was a bird, and then shot the mother. The group continued to walk down the street of the town, and Mom snuck downstairs and followed at a distance. At the edge of town, there was a large field, and someone had dug a great big pit in that field. The Jews were forced to stand around the edge of that pit. Mom found a fence and hid behind it and watched. She watched as the parents covered their children's eyes with their hands, and she watched as they were shot and fell into the pit and then quickly buried. Now, Mom was raised Catholic, and she had a simple childlike faith, but she said, watching this horrific event, she said, I raised my hands up to the heavens and I said, my God, where are you? How can you let something like this happen? I don't understand. She was so upset, she screamed out, I don't even believe you're there. But as she kept walking, she said there was an answer in her heart, in her soul, and it was this: that God gives us free will to be good or bad, to help and heal, or to hurt and harm, and it's up to us to decide what we'll do. And she said it was right then and there she made a promise, a vow, that if there was ever anything she could do, she would. Well, she continued on, and she finally found the right town where her aunt lived, the right house. And thankfully, when she got there, she found that her whole family had gone looking for her, and they had a wonderful short reunion because the Germans came and they took her father away. He was an architect, and they wanted him to build factories for the German war front. And in war, you do what you're told or you're killed. So my grandfather and grandmother and the three younger of my mom's sisters, they went to be with them, but they didn't take my mom or the next sister because where they were going was next to a facility that trained German soldiers, and they didn't want the two teenage girls being close to that. A few weeks later, my mom and aunt and sister went to church one Sunday morning, and when they left the building, they found that they were surrounded by German soldiers who pushed and shoved and segregated people. If you were very old, you were put aside. Very young, you were put aside. But everyone who was capable of work were shoved in trucks. My mom was put in a truck separated from her family and taken to the town of Tarnopol, where she was forced to work in a munitions factory, making ammunition for the German war front. The conditions were horrible. It was freezing cold. There was barely enough to eat, and Mom became very anemic. And one day, a high-ranking German officer, a major, came through the factory to make sure that production was being kept up. And when he walked by Mom's section, she ended up fainting right at his feet. When she woke up, she was so terrified that if he thought she wasn't capable of working, he'd send her further away or just have her killed. And so she pleaded with him, please, sir, I haven't been well, but I'm strong and I can do this job. Just give me one more chance, please. This major, who was about 60 years old, looked at this then 18-year-old girl who was blonde, blue-eyed, very Aryan. Her last name was Gut. And he asked her, are you a German girl? And she answered truthfully, no, I'm Polish. He said, I like that you're honest, but it's apparent you can't keep up. You'll come with me, I'll give you another job. So he took her to the camp that he was in charge of. It wasn't a concentration camp, it was a camp that housed German officers, soldiers, secretaries. Mom's job would be serving meals in the diner, and she was given one other job, to oversee the laundry room. And it was when she went in the laundry room that she was introduced to the 12 Jewish people who worked there. One was a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, an accountant, a nurse, people of means, people with beautiful homes, precious things. Everything they had been taken from them, given to someone else, and now they lived in the ghetto next door. and took care of their captives' clothes. They were starving, but Mom found it was easy to sneak food from the diner, enough sometimes for them to distribute through the ghetto. But more important than food, she realized when she was serving meals in the diner and the SS were there, the Gestapo, she could overhear conversations. I mean, after all, she was just a girl. They didn't censor what they said around her. She could hear about when there was going to be raids in town, where they would go into a new section of town and without any warning bust into your house and search it from top to bottom to see if there was Jews hiding in there. And if they found them, the Jews and your entire family would be taken away. She could get that information to her friends. They could spread the word through the ghetto, and because of their networking, hundreds of people were able to leave areas before they were raided. But one night, the major had one of the heads of the Nazi party at his table. And when she went up to serve him, she heard the Nazi tell the major, "Next week, don't plan on having any of your Jews here." The major actually argued, "What are you talking about? I've got quotas to fill. How am I going to get my work done without my workers?" And the Nazi said, "You hire Poles like her. Hire gypsies. I don't care. I have my orders that by this time next week there won't be one Jew left alive." And Mom knew that that meant her 12 friends as well. And she had the difficult decision on whether she should tell them that in a week, even the little bit they had would be taken. But finally she realized she had to. And when she told them, they pleaded with her, "Irene, help us. Hide us, do something." She said, "I have a little room above the diner with a single cot. I've got no place to hide 12 people." But that night she got down on her knees and she prayed for a miracle. And in the morning she had one, because the major came to her and he said, "I'm taking a villa at the end of town. I'm going to be doing a lot of entertaining. You're going to come and be my housekeeper." He sent her to look at the villa that day, and when she walked up to the front doorway, Mom noticed a mezuzah there on the doorpost. She had enough Jewish friends growing up to tell her exactly what that meant. A Jewish family had lived there, a wealthy Jewish family, and there was rumors that wealthy Jewish families often had a hiding place somewhere in their house, and she prayed that was true. So she asked the major for a pass so she could go from the camp to the villa over the next couple of days, and over those next couple of days she helped all 12 of her friends escape out of the laundry room, out of the camp, down the streets of the town, to the villa, down a coal chute, and into the basement, until all 12 of them were there in the basement of the German major's house. And she breathed a sigh of relief until the major finally came and walked through the place. "Irene, this place is filthy. I want it scrubbed and I want it painted from top to bottom." And he made her arrive the next couple of days with a squad of German soldiers ready to do that. She kept her friends quiet in the basement and started the soldiers upstairs. And when they were finished, she brought the soldiers from the front staircase down, took her friends from the back staircase up, hid them in a tiny spot up in the attic for days while the house was cleaned and painted. Finally, those soldiers left. She was able to bring her friends back down to the basement and breathe a sigh of relief until the major came back to look at the progress. "Oh, Irene, the house looks much better. It's going to be ready for entertaining. It's going to be large parties, people, 30, 40, 50 people a night. And to help you, I'm going to bring a young soldier who can help you with everything. He can sleep in the basement." That would not work. So she pleaded with him, "Please, I'd be a nervous wreck having a young man with me all day long." She had to tell him what had happened to her with the Soviets about the rapes. He said, "Don't be an idiot. Nothing's going to happen to you in my house. You're perfectly safe here." But she pleaded and she begged until finally he said, "Enough. I'll give you one chance. The first time you embarrass me, the first time you can't keep up, my soldier comes in." So they had a really great arrangement, because every morning the major would get up, have breakfast, and he would leave the villa to go back to the camp. And Mom would follow behind him with her house key. And as soon as he left, she put her key in the inside doorknob. That way, if he came home before he was supposed to, he couldn't open the door. He'd have to ring the doorbell. While he was gone during the day, they searched through that villa hoping to find a hiding place, and sure enough, they did. It was down in the basement. You actually had to lay on your belly on the ground, but there was one tiny piece of wood on the wall that could be removed. And when it was, you saw a tunnel that wrapped around the whole side of the villa and ended in a small room that sat just underneath the gazebo in the side yard. So every day, the major would get up, have his breakfast, grab his hat, his coat, his briefcase, head out the door. Mom would follow, put her key in the lock, then open up the basement door, and all 12 of her friends came up. The men did the heavy lifting, the repair work. The women did the cooking, the cleaning, the polishing, the laundry, the ironing. And every day the major came home amazed at what a teenage girl could accomplish. And that's how they lived for 2 years, until 2 of the 12 in the basement, a married couple who had been married for years and never had been able to have children, found out that they were expecting. And what do babies do? Cry. These parents desperately wanted the child, but they felt like they had no choice, and my mom was given a list of supplies to go to the pharmacy to terminate the pregnancy. She pleaded with them. Ida Laser, that was her name, Ida Laser Holler. Please don't do this. I don't know how, but I believe that it's a sign that everything will work out. I've already seen so many innocent people murdered. Hitler's not going to have this baby. It took a lot of convincing, but finally they all agreed we'll either all live together or we'll all die together. And life went on until Mom had to go to town one afternoon to get some more food and supplies for an upcoming party. And when she was in the store, she said 2 German officers came in and screamed at everyone, "Get outside!" She didn't know what was going on, but when she walked out on the street, she was pushed along with everybody else down the street into the marketplace where there was a set of gallows that had been erected. There was a Polish family with 2 small children, and they had been caught hiding a Jewish family in their house. In Poland, it was a death sentence to even feed a Jew, and not just for yourself, for your parents, your children, the whole family. That day in town, everyone was forced to stand and see what that looked like. Mom said that they hung the children first and made the parents watch. And she said, walking home that day, she was like a zombie. All she could think of is, I can't tell my friends what I've seen. There's nothing they could do about it. It would just upset them. But because she was so shook up, she forgot to do what she had done every day before that. She forgot to leave her key in the door. She went to the kitchen and she put her groceries down, opened up the basement door, let 3 of the women come up to help her with the evening meal. She said, we were standing there cooking and talking, and all of a sudden there was a noise. They looked up and there was the major, chin shaking, eyes bulging. He took one look at these women. He knew they were in his laundry room, and he turned right around and went to his office where the telephone was. Mom told her friends to get downstairs, and she said, I ran after him, and I grabbed a hold of his legs to stop him. He turned around and screamed at her, how could you do this? In my own home, under my own nose, after everything I've done, why? She was crying and said, they're my friends. No one has the right to kill because of race or religion. These people, they've done nothing wrong. Punish me. Kill me, but let them go. They're innocent. He screamed, turn you in? You think I can march you down to the Gestapo and tell them I didn't know I had Jews hiding in my own house? They'll kill me just to save their own skin. I have to have time to think. I'm going to go to my office, and when I do, don't you go anywhere. Don't you talk to anyone. As soon as he left, she ran in the kitchen. She got food and water, went down to the basement, gave it to her friends, and said, get in the hiding place. If I don't come back in 3 days, it means I'm dead. You'll have to get yourself out. And she went back upstairs to wait. Finally, he came back. He went into his office, sat behind his desk, and she had no choice but to go and face him. And when she did, he reached out and grabbed her by the waist, pulled her down on his lap. I've made a decision. I'm going to keep your secret, before price. You have to be mine anytime I ask, and willingly. Mom said there was no decision to be made. There was too many lives at stake. And she never told her friends what she had to do. She said their integrity would have never let her make that decision. But they did all survive. And eventually, the Soviets started pushing the Germans out of Poland, and the whole war front was beginning to collapse. And the major came to Mom at one point and said, I have my orders to move my unit. Are you going to come with me? And she said, I want to find my family. It had been almost 5 years. She didn't know if her parents or 4 sisters were even alive. So as he started to make arrangements to move out, Mom took his wagon and her friends by 2, laid them in the bottom of the wagon, covered them with blankets and shovels, food, and rode from the villa out to the forest where the partisans were, back and forth, until they were all there. And she stayed with them on that last trip. And 6 days later, a little baby boy was born out there in the woods in freedom. Ida and Laser named their son Roman Holler. Mom said holding baby Roman was her payment in full for everything she'd gone through. Now they wanted her to continue to stay out in the forest with them, but she wanted to find her family, and she left. A lot of things happened during this time, but eventually my mom was caught, this time by the Soviets. She was accused of being a spy. After all, she was the mistress of a high-ranking German official, and she was accused of being one of the leaders of the partisans. She was put in a concentration camp and tortured for months. Now the Soviets, they hired men to deliver food once a week to prisoners and to the people there. And at one point, after Mom had been there 2 or 3 months, one of the men they hired happened to be one of the men she'd hid in the basement of the major's house. And when he got there, he happened to see her, and he called out, Irene, what are you doing here? She was so overwhelmed at seeing a friendly face, she said, I couldn't speak a word. But they made a way to smuggle her out of that camp. They dyed her blonde hair black, gave her false identity papers. She wasn't going to be Irena Gut, Polish Catholic. Now she was Sonia Soferstein, a Jewish refugee. They smuggled her out of Poland and put her in a DP camp in Germany, where she sat for 2 years trying to find her life. Her father had been shot and killed by the Germans. Her mother had a stroke, didn't survive. She couldn't find out anything about her 4 little sisters. Her hope, she was in this camp primarily with all Jewish people, and her hope was to go to Israel along with them. But one afternoon there was an American delegate who came to do interviews of the survivors, and the rabbi there at that camp said, I want you to talk to our little Polish Catholic girl. He interviewed her with English and French. Mom could speak Polish, German, Russian, and a lot of Yiddish. And through an interpreter, they told each other. She told her story to him, and afterwards he said, the United States of America would be very honored to have you. She wanted to stay in Poland and try and find her sisters, but she was wanted by the Germans and the Russians now, and she was afraid if they survived, she could bring trouble to them. So in 1949, she came on a ship into Ellis Island. I loved that part when she would tell her own story. She stood on the bow of that boat and saw the Statue of Liberty, and she said, I put a do not disturb sign over my memories. I'm in a new place. I have a fresh start, a new beginning. I will never think about that. My life starts here. Well, when she came into New York, she didn't have one word of English, had no money, and didn't know a soul here. But she could speak Yiddish, and she was in New York. And she made a lot of great Jewish friends who helped her find an apartment, helped her get a job in the garment district. It took Mom 5 years, but she became a United States citizen. And to celebrate, she was going to take herself to a nice restaurant in Manhattan. As she was sitting there in the restaurant, a man came up to sit in the next table, and he looked at her and he said, Irene, is that you? He was the UN delegate who'd interviewed her in the displaced persons camp, the very man that invited her to the United States. He asked that pretty young blonde if she wanted to have dinner that night, and the next night, and 6 weeks later, they were married. My parents moved out to Southern California. Mom became an interior decorator, and at the time of 14 years old, I never heard this story at all. We were having dinner one night, the phone rang, and Mom answered the phone, and on the other end of the line was a young man who was doing a report in school, and his topic, the Holocaust never happened. It's just propaganda drummed up by the Jews, so we'd feel sorry for them. And he was calling random people to find out what they thought. He sure found out. And I did too. I remember looking at my dad saying, "What is she talking about?" He's the only person in this country who knew her story, and he was enough of a gentleman to wait till she was ready to share it. What I do remember is Mom hanging up the phone that night, tears streaming down her face from bringing up these memories almost 40 years back, and her looking at us and saying, "All these years that I've kept silent, I've allowed evil, I've allowed the enemy to win, because when we don't stand up and speak out against hate, history will continue to repeat itself." And she said, "I am willing to go anywhere to talk to anyone so that these things never happen." There's a lot more to the story. Our time is limited, but if I could leave you with one word, it's love. When you're willing to love big time like that, not the overused word that we have in Valentine cards and all that. Love with skin on, love that hurts, love that's difficult. When you're willing to love like that, your life goes from this size to endless, the possibilities that it opens up. In 1982, my mom received a phone call from a young man named Roman Holler. He was that baby born in the woods. It was the joy of her life, but she found out something amazing when she met him, and that's what happened to the major after the war. Major Edward Rugemer went back to his wife in Germany, but she'd heard that he'd had a long affair with his young Polish housekeeper. She wanted nothing to do with him, and he was literally forced to live on the streets as a homeless man. When Ida and Laser Holler heard about that, they put baby Roman in the back seat. They drove to that town. They looked at every homeless face until they found him. They put him in the back seat, took him home, and Roman grew up calling him Zeta until he died. It's a shocking story, but if I can add one more word to the power of love, it's forgiveness. If you want to have power stronger than any weapon, it's forgiveness and love. You put those things together because they melt the hardest of hearts and they open the most closed minds. Can one person make a difference? One person and God? It's endless what can be done. Thank you so much for sharing.